dehumanization by retaining their faith and dignity in the face of awful evil. And you have to be very careful because the Holocaust was also about defeat, not victory. And the victory that we have is a victory in the aftermath with what you have done and what everybody else has done with the memory of the Holocaust, which is to use it as a moral tool. And the question always becomes, how do you describe the local population? It's easier to describe the Germans as awful than it is, for example, in French to tell the role of the Frenchman. But in France, now you have to tell the role of the Frenchman, otherwise you're not credible. And there's an attempt now, for example, in Budapest by an extreme right-wing government that wants to rewrite what the Budapest Museum is doing with regard to the Holocaust, to cleanse right-wing political forces in Hungary of responsibility for the Holocaust. If they succeed, then you have a complete politicalization of the Holocaust in Hungary. If they don't succeed, then you're making a statement about the dangers that this could go to, and the clash is very significant. And in Germany, in Austria, Austria described itself at first as the first of the Nazi victims, and they convinced themselves, for example, that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was German. And consequently, they had to come a very long way to beginning to confront the degree to which Austria was part of this, part and parcel of it. And I'm giving slight advice to the recreation, the reshaping of the Jewish memorial, of the memorial to Austria at Auschwitz, which is going to tell a far different story. Other questions? Yes, sir.
How can we educate the youngest among us from a young age so that when they grow up knowing what happened, and so that the events of the Holocaust are not repeated, but also not, as you said, to cause them to be more shaken up?
Okay. You sometimes have to lie to children. And that is the following, that if I want to create well-adjusted children, I have to teach them two absolutely fundamental lessons. Number one, that the world is safe, and number two, that I'm here to protect you, to a certain age. Neither of those are true of the Holocaust. And consequently, there has to be a way in which you teach, but you don't overwhelm, you don't traumatize, you don't dramatically deal with certain things, because they're simply not prepared to handle it. And the consequences of that are terrible. One of the easy ways, one of the ways of doing that is there are some very good books. There are very few good movies. There are also wonderfully good survivor testimonies that can be used, but not many that keep it away from it. But in one sense, I had a conversation last week about somebody who's talking about how you teach an Israel curriculum to schools. So she said, you tell the story at one level in 6th grade, and then you repeat it at a very different level in 9th grade. In 6th grade, you present a unidimensional portrait of Herzl. In 9th grade, you present a much more complex portrait of Herzl. In 5th grade, you present certain things. In 6th grade or 7th grade, in 10th grade and 11th grade, you present other things. I recited something today which some of you were old enough to remember. Yesterday was Tu B'Shvat, and the Arbor Day and the like. And when I was growing up, we used to make that as a major event for establishing a contact with Israel's agricultural roots. But they did something very bizarre because of the nature of transportation. And some of you are old enough to have experienced this. We used to eat boxer. And you're shaking. Now, how anybody could develop a love for, first of all, we didn't know what to do with it, whether to hit with it or scratch with it or whatever have you. But how anybody developed a love for Boxer, I do not know. And I don't know, you know, Israel has magnificent fruits and all sorts of things and all of the produce, etc., etc. But we were teaching you with Boxer. You have to teach things differently to younger kids and to and when I first came to Israel, I was surprised by, you know, the fact that I'd bite into a tomato and the juice would come all over me because the tomato had just been picked the other day. I get that in California. I didn't get that growing up in New York. But in one sense, you have to educate differently at different ages, and our goal for education is to give people what they can handle at the level that they're at, and to both reveal and at certain times to conceal, but also not to use trauma to merely traumatize for the sake of trauma. That's why I'm against all sorts of games playing and all sorts of over-dramatization of the whole thing. And you have to be careful. By the way, how you do that is a complex question, but that you should do that is a simple answer. Yes, ma'am.
In the United States Holocaust Museum, when we were there, there's a big wall, like inside, like the medical in the United States Holocaust Museum, there was an exhibit when we were there. There was a wall surrounding it, and inside there was an exhibit about the medical experiment. Now, I assumed at the time that this was supposed to be so children couldn't see it easily. And for my young child, it had the exact opposite effect. What's behind that wall? And drew him to it.
Very good.
And I wondered what was the
Okay,
thing.
let me tell you the logic of it, and let me tell you the failure of it, and let me tell you that if it were up to me, it's one of the first things I would remove. We had a question of how do you create, first of all, you have to understand when we're creating a Holocaust museum, the question is, would they come? Now, in retrospect, when you're one of the most visited museums in Washington, and you know 34 million people have visited the museum, you don't have to wonder if they're going to come. And the other is, will they come again? And the third question is, will they walk out of there screaming because it's an atrocity? So our designer came up with a very interesting suggestion. Would you, for example, create privacy walls so that a kid under 11 or under 10 would have to be lifted up to look over at 3 different points? One is at the gruesome pictures of liberation, the other is at the medical experimentation, the third example is the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units. And we used that as a vehicle to get our board to go along with the inclusion of this horror within the museum. We're protecting your grandchildren from this, so let us include it. Now, number one, kids are used to horrific imagery. If you go to the museum we created in Skokie, we present that imagery on a large television screen, and nobody has walked out of there screaming and the like. They all understand it. We created a certain context. And we're fair to our visitor. We say you're about to see graphic imagery. If you care to walk through it, that is your prerogative. But these privacy walls were 20 years ago an attempt to get a board that was frightened of what it was permitting to be shown, to allow us to show it. And now they have, you'll forgive the term, but they have the attraction, which is people always like to look at the forbidden. It's the way in which they used to show, I'm told they used to show porno films years ago. You know, the peepholes and all of that stuff, to see the forbidden. And if it were up to me, I would take them out now. They've served their function. Everybody trusts the Holocaust Museum as a tasteful museum and the like. We haven't overdone it, therefore you don't need it anymore. And that would allow us to show the Einsatzgruppen, which is a central part of it. 1,500,000 Jews were killed by the Einsatzgruppen, and we have 3 very small displays on it. Inadequate, wrong, etc. You got to do it right. So you've picked up something very important, and the reasoning behind it was because we were afraid we wouldn't get permission to show it. So everybody who's ever worked with a board understands that you try to work with a board and you try to get the maximum you can out of your board without putting them in jeopardy and without putting your job in jeopardy, at least not unless you want to. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Michael, there, I assume it's still there, there's an IBM punch card machine, which is a very bad book. Your comments?
Yeah, and first of all, I agree with you on both. There's an IBM punch card about which a very bad book was written. The name of the bad book is IBM and the Holocaust. It's by a fellow by the name of Edwin Black. And I reviewed the book. I thought it was enormously problematic. But the machine is called a Hollerith machine. We're in Washington, D.C. All governments have access to information. What they do with the information is of the utmost of importance, and I have more power in this than they had in that incredible Hollerith machine. And the government could, if it wanted to, in 1 second, using my Social Security numbers, close down all of my bank accounts and all of my credit cards. Government has census information that it uses and that it tries not to abuse. So the question is, we showed a fair exhibition on the management of information, what information government has, and how it uses it. And somebody took it and and presumed that what you knew in 1934 was identical to what you knew in 44. And presumed what you knew in 39 was identical to what you knew in 41, and presumed what you knew in 41 was identical to what you knew in 46. Not that IBM were saints, but because he wrote a bad book, that should occasion the writing of a good book. It shouldn't criticize us for presenting something in a deeply responsible way that was well researched and that essentially deals with a central question which is becoming larger and larger in our world. What is the zone of privacy? What is the zone of protection? And who's going to save us from the misuse of all of this information? I mean, you have films about this, about how they cut a guy's entire identity up with one move of one computer, and you can't tell me for a moment that had the Nazis had that capacity, they would not have done that immediately, effectively, and directly. So I've read plenty of bad books. I hope that I haven't written plenty of bad books. I have certain sections of certain books that I've written that I would like to take back, and because I've learned more. But I'm going to say this. One of the terrible things about our political climate with the flip-flops is nobody has the courage to say, I'm smarter today than I was yesterday. I hope to be smarter tomorrow than I was the day before yesterday. So allow me to grow, which means the capacity to grow is the capacity to what? To change your mind and to learn more. I say in my work, I'm an empiricist. I can be persuaded by evidence. Persuaded. Yes, sir.
What's on the site of Part 51, the Holocaust at the World Trade Center?
Okay, I took a strong stance on it, which said the following. Number one, that for people who objected, number one, that the most fundamental statement of Jewish rights in America early on was made by George Washington in a letter to the Hebrew Hebrew congregation in Newport.
It does not make sense. Say he got it from Gershom, sexist.
No, excuse me. I'll give you the background. George Washington got it from the letter of invitation he received to the Newport Hebrew congregation. He mirrored the invitation almost word for word, but the fact is that since the President of the United States said it, it was said by the President of the United States. He was not original in saying it. He sort of parried the invitation he received. I've done a considerable amount of work. What Washington essentially said is it's not a matter of toleration, but of natural rights. And that is, it's not a matter of toleration that a larger group tolerates the other group. In the United States, it is a matter of natural rights. This government to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution gives no assistance. It merely demands that those who live under its protection offer their allegiance to the same and conduct themselves, and here I'm paraphrasing, and conduct themselves as responsible citizens in due course, throughout, etc. My point was that essentially the fundamental letter of American democracy was that we demand of people that they comport themselves as responsible citizens, and we cannot say that they could not open their own house of worship. Furthermore, and this was the point of contention, we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the memorial at 9/11 and in the museum at 9/11. I've seen the elements of the museum at 9/11, which are going to be enormously powerful. I saw the memorial as it was evolving at 9/11. Anybody who imagined that a mosque located a couple blocks away was going to overshadow the memorial and the museum didn't understand the functions of memorials and museums that tell a story, that invite an audience. Millions of people will come to the museum and the memorial. Hundreds of thousands, if not more than that, have already come to the memorial. And a building 2 blocks away or 3 blocks away will just not overshadow it. It can't happen. Especially if they create a good museum and a good memorial. No single institution can overshadow that because no institution is going to play that public role. And I feel vindicated by the events that have taken place since, that the memorial and the museum will play their role, and that this was much to do about very little. And the one criticism we have to take of the stance that I took is that we have to see how that it plays out in the Muslim world. And if in the Muslim world it is regarded as a state that 9/11 and the attack on the World Trade Center and the building of a mosque, the mosque is portrayed, as it were, as the triumph of Islam, even in the heart of that. But that is not about what's going to happen in America. That's about what's going to happen in the Muslim world, and one has to be mindful of that. But if you're taking seriously American values and the formative document of George Washington, people have natural rights. The demand we can make is that people comport themselves as honorable citizens, offering allegiance to the United States of America. If they do that, they have the natural right in our form of government to create their religious houses of worships wherever they can buy the property, afford the property, etc. And nobody should regard that as diminishing the memorial or taking away from the memorial. And think of it for a moment. You heard all the publicity about the memorial recently. How much have you heard about either the progress or the non-progress of the mosque being built nearby? It's been overwhelmed by reality. It was predictable that it'd be overwhelmed by reality. So.
Okay, I think we have enough time for one more question.
Okay, young lady in the back.
Hello. Thank you for coming and giving your speech. I greatly admire your work. And as a future educator, I admire that you turn the controversies into educational opportunities and further improve the education of the museum. If there was a class in DC and they only had 10 minutes to be inside the museum, what part of it do you think is the most important to see and why?
Okay. There's a technical term for that. I want you to, there are 2 technical terms for that. If you have a project, you always must have what is called an elevator speech. What would you do if you got into an elevator with, Bill Gates, and you wanted between the first and the 22nd floor to interest Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or, George Soros? I'm going through the list of, the 50 most generous philanthropists in America. You wanted to introduce Michael Bloomberg to your project. What would you say in the elevator up? How quickly can you get it out? We call that in museum parlance the 60-mile-an-hour visitor. And we have experience with what the messages of 60-mile-an-hour visitors are, because what do billboards do? Billboards are an effective way of communication at 60 miles an hour. In Los Angeles, you say at about 6 or 7 miles an hour, but theoretically they should be at 60 miles an hour. What would I want people to see? I would want people to walk through the railroad car, the concentration barrack, and then what I call in my work face-to-face with death. Shoes, the crematoria, and that shoes, the crematoria and that apparatus, the pictures of, and finally the world of Ashishki, in which they saw presence, and we made them feel absence. The rest of it is commentary, but Hillel once said, if you want to know the whole Bible on one leg, say what is distasteful unto you, do not do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary, go study it. If the Bible could be given as an elevator speech, it wouldn't have been the Bible. And if a museum can be given at 60 miles an hour, it's not a terribly good museum. But that's what I want people to see, and I think people come out with seeing it. One of the things I do occasionally for a living is I participate in evaluations of museums by asking, audiences, what is it they see, what is it they learn, what is it they do? And you're always surprised with the gap between those who intended to create what they wanted the audience to know and what the audience actually knows. Let me conclude with one more thing, which is an interesting thing. Let me talk about endings of museums. We had a problem in Washington with how do you end the story of the Holocaust. And we failed with dozens of endings. Some were trite, sign a document, I hereby pledge, to oppose genocide. And we finally decided that the only ending that was proper, the only ending that was possible, was an ending that told the story of the Holocaust, so we ended with a film. With the idea that you would listen to people reciting what it was like to be there, and you'd get a sense of what its responsibility was and the like. And the idea is that however long you stayed there, you would begin to experience the humanity of those who went through it. The second thing that you're trying to do in a museum is what they now call, as a formal language, it's called a takeaway. What do you bring with you from the museum? Now, for example, I was involved fairly influentially at the beginning, marginally toward the middle, and then again at the end in the National Museum of American Jewish History, and they have a wonderful takeaway. And we had a takeaway in Daniel's story, but not a takeaway in the Holocaust Museum in the permanent exhibition. In Daniel's story, we asked kids to write a letter to Daniel. Do something to articulate. What would you say to him? If Daniel was sitting with you, what would you do to him? And some would say, I'd merely, hold you in my arms and hug you, etc. In Philadelphia, what we did is we tried to say that the Museum of American Jewish History, it's your story. It's a story of the evolution of freedom because it's built in Philadelphia, it's built adjacent to the Liberty Belt. It's your story, and then we conclude by giving people the incredible opportunity to tell their story in response to what they've seen. And then with technology today, to email it back to themselves. And it appears all over Facebook. people have an interesting takeaway. And that means that when my kids saw the museum, they then sent that they were at the museum to 100 people with their contribution, which gave you free marketing to 100 people, who then, when they do that, they will also send it to 100 people. And that means one visit transforms into 10, transforms into 50, transforms into 100. We're trying to figure out, I'm always trying to figure out what's the takeaway. What's the takeaway from a Holocaust museum? Now, I know how to do it in words. And in words, I do it because a survivor told the story that his opening night in a concentration camp, the man who was the capo was a good capo. Not all capos were bad. And he said at the end, he said, this is what you're going to face, and he described everything. And then he said one line that I think is sacred and marvelous. He said, I've told you this story, not to weaken you, but to strengthen you. Now it's up to you. I know how to present that in writing. Maybe some of you will help me to present it another way. But that's what I'd like to communicate at the end. And if you ask me what's the elevator thing, I've told you the story, not to weaken you, but to strengthen you, and now it's up to you. Thank you very much.
Can hardly wait to get away from here. Only a few short months later, Robert Harlan traveled to Germany for his semester abroad at the University of Marburg. His diary describes what he witnessed on Kristallnacht, which is the focus of tonight's remembrance ceremonies. While Peter is going to describe the historical context of Kristallnacht, the actions that took place that day and the aftermath, I want to show you this diary as another example of what ordinary Americans witnessed at the time and what he wrote about what he saw. Like many students living abroad for the first time, Robert sought out familiar faces, people that he thought would help him. And there was a Jewish couple who were the parents of one of his friends from school in the US. The student had managed to get to the United States, but his parents, Dr. Stern, who was a lawyer, and his wife were still in Germany. When Robert traveled, he got to Germany before the semester was starting, and so he stayed with the Sterns for a couple of weeks at their home in Würzburg before traveling on to Marburg. In the early entries of his diary, he comments about what's going on with the Sterns, and he writes that he can't believe how the Sterns are being forced to sell their home at an unfair price. This is the entry, I know you can't read it, but how he can't believe that they're being forced to sell their home, and he can't believe that such a renowned citizen as Dr. Stern is being treated in such a manner. In another interesting entry, he visits Oberammergau, which is a place that's been staging the Passion Play of the death of Christ for about 300 years at this point. And he finds it, his phrase is ironical, that Oberammergau has big signs outside the town that say that no Jews are welcome here. And he sees the irony between staging a Passion Play about the death of Christ and the announcement that no Jews are welcome in Oberammergau. On November 9th, before he knows about the events that are about to transpire, Robert writes about how he's on chapter 3 of Mein Kampf, and he's already numbed by the experience, and he finds it amazing, dumbfounding to think that the author of such a book could be the leader of such a great country. On November 10th, once he's heard about the Kristallnacht pogroms, Robert explains in his diary that the German ambassador in Paris is dead, and the Marburg synagogue has been burned down. He writes, and this is very interesting, he writes, a coincidence, a Jewish trick for newspaper manipulation and world sympathy, as Dr. Biederman so strongly contends, or an actual act of persecution. So even as late as 1938, Americans who were hearing Nazi propaganda